Harry, yep, I'm on. All right. Welcome to week 7. Okay. This is on, is the Bible anti-science? So let me say a prayer before we begin, mostly for me. Okay, let's pray. Father, I thank you for your word, and as every other time that we gather, Lord, I ask for your wisdom, that you would help us to rightly interpret your word, to understand what you're trying to say to us, and for us to receive that. And Father, I thank you for everything you've provided in your word, and of course, I thank you for the word, Jesus. It's in his name we pray. Amen. All right, so tonight I'm going to ask you, some of you, to do something that might be difficult, but I want you to try. I want you to lock in your head tonight, what if you are a brand new Christian? You've never read the Bible before, or you've been a Christian for a while and you've not read the Bible, and maybe you're a young person, maybe you're in high school, you're in college, and you're just being exposed to the Bible for the first time. That's the mindset I want you to put yourselves in. Because some of you that are more mature Christians, when I go through this presentation, you're going to want to argue with me the whole time. And I will be glad to argue with you when we get to the Q&A. Well, not argue with you, but have a great conversation. But this presentation is really focused on people who aren't familiar with the Bible, who've never read it before, who are coming to it with fresh eyes trying to read it for the first time, or maybe someone who is trying to find out if Christianity is true or not, and they're doing some research, they're reading the Bible. And really that's what Dan Kimball, that's the audience he's trying to speak to primarily in this book. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is mostly Genesis 1 through 11. I'm going to focus on Genesis 1 through 11, but what we're going to talk about tonight can just as easily be applied to all the other parts of the Bible. So even though I'm going to focus on Genesis 1 through 11 tonight, the concepts we're going to discuss can easily be used in other parts of the Bible. Okay, so let's dive right in. The projector's having problems up there. So the key to Bible interpretation. So I want you to keep this in mind tonight. The most vital question for interpreters of any kind of literature, and especially the Bible, is to ask, what did the human author and ultimately the divine author, God the Holy Spirit, intend for his original audience to understand when they read the passage? We're going to hammer on that over and over and over again tonight. And we've talked about this before, earlier in the class. We talked about that's how you have to interpret Bible passages, is how did the original audience hear it, and what did the original author intend to communicate? Now, the way I'm going to approach this topic tonight is I went through a lot of different ways of structuring the material, but what I ended up with tonight is I'm going to ask questions in the slides, and then I'm going to answer those questions. So it's going to be like almost a Socratic dialogue, except I'm going to be dialoguing with myself until we get to the end, and then you can dialogue with me. But I'm going to ask questions that I think I would want to know the answers to if I was going through this material. So a lot of the material is obviously coming from the book, How Not to Read the Bible, but I've brought in some other supplementary material as well, because there are some issues that I didn't think he covered very well in the book. All right, so we're going to dive right into the deep end. What questions arise from a strict literal reading of Genesis 1? Now, before I answer this question, we need to talk about what is a strict literal reading. So, a strict literal reading of a text means when you read it, you take it at face value. Whatever it says, that's what happened. So, a figurative reading of a text would be, when I read the text, I'm going to assume there's metaphor, simile, figures of speech, symbolism, figurative language, right? So poetry is figurative language, for example. So if I'm a brand new Christian, I've never read the Bible, and I read Genesis 1 strictly literally, very literally, I'm allowing for almost no figurative language, these are the kind of things that are going to hit me upside the head. First, the length of creation. Does the Bible say that God created everything? The universe, the heavens, the earth, everything on earth, including people, in less than a week in 6 24-hour days? If you read it in a strict literal fashion, that's what it appears to be saying. But if I'm new to the Bible and I read it for the first time, this is going to strike me. Second, what about the age of the earth? If the Bible teaches that God created everything in 6 days, does it mean we have to believe the earth is only 6,000 years old, 6 to 10,000 years old? And the way people come up with 6,000 years old is they add up the genealogies in Genesis, and they count backwards from today, and they say the earth was created 6,000 years ago. If you read Genesis 1 through 11 in a strictly literal fashion. All right, what about this one? The earth and sun sequence of creation. So if you recall from Genesis 1, the earth is created on day 3 and the sun is created on day 4. Well, that's weird, because how is there light for each day before day 4, and how is the earth suspended in space if the sun, which of course the earth orbits around, wasn't created until day 4? So again, if you're reading in a strictly literal fashion, you get to day 4, you don't see the sun created till day 4. You know, that's kind of weird. I've never read the Bible before. I don't understand what this means. What about creation versus evolution? If the Bible teaches God created in the way the words say in Genesis, does that mean what I'm learning about evolution is false? So it's either the Bible or evolution is correct. Put yourself in the place of a university student, a high school student, someone in their 20s, someone in their 30s, whatever, who's been taught macroevolution in college and high school or whatever. If they're reading Genesis in a very literal sense, they're going to face this question. Is it either evolution or the Bible, or, can both be true? I don't know. It's a problem. And then what about dinosaurs? In science class, you're taught that dinosaurs lived, 65 million years ago, something like that. But if I read the creation sequence as God creating humans and all land creatures on the same 24-hour day, does that mean it is saying that dinosaurs and human beings coexisted? If you read it in a strict literal sense, it seems to be implying that dinosaurs and human beings lived at the same time. So these are the kinds of questions that people come to Genesis, they read it for the first time, and they're left wondering, how do I deal with this? How do I interpret these verses? So this leads to the next question. So I told you I'm going to keep asking questions, and they'll get more and more fun as we go. Does a strict literal reading of Genesis 1 through 11 conflict with science? By the way, I should have said this already. Why am I talking about Genesis 1 through 11 instead of just the whole book of Genesis? Well, because Bible scholars have noticed for 2,000 years, or probably longer, that the first 11 chapters of Genesis are very different from the next chapter 12 through 50. Very different. And so it's often been called the proto-history or the primeval history. There's all sorts of names for it. But the genre, the literary genre of Genesis 1 through 11 is very different from 12 through 50. When you get to chapter 12, you all of a sudden land in Abraham. It's Abraham, it's his family, they're moving, God's meeting with Abraham. It becomes very much a historical narrative after that. But Genesis 1 through 11 is in a genre all of its own. And so that's why I keep talking about Genesis 1 through 11. So, does a strict literal reading of Genesis 1 through 11 conflict with science? It does. It really does. So most people think it just conflicts with evolutionary biology, but if you read Genesis 1 through 11 strictly literally, it conflicts with astronomy, atmospheric science, evolutionary biology, genetics, paleoanthropology, cultural anthropology, biogeography, geology, linguistics. There's a bunch of other fields it conflicts with. So a lot of people think, well, the problem is just with evolution, right? It conflicts with evolution, but that's not right. If you read it in a strict literal sense, it actually conflicts with a lot of scientific disciplines. So when someone's coming to these passages for the first time, they're in university, they're taking classes on biology, they're taking classes on genetics, on astronomy, anthropology, and so forth, they're going to have this cognitive dissonance if they read Genesis 1 through 11 in a strict literal fashion. They're going to be learning one thing from reading Genesis 1 through 11, and they're going to be learning something else in their science classes. So this leads to the next question. Must we interpret Genesis 1 through 11 in a strict literal way? Is that the only way to interpret it? So now I haven't done a head count. This is my impression. And someone could quibble and say, well, how do you know it's most? I think it's most, but I can't prove it. But I think most conservative evangelical Old Testament scholars believe that there are legitimate interpretations of Genesis 1 through 11 that contain significant symbolism and figurative language. Notice all the adjectives I put. I didn't say most Bible scholars or Old Testament scholars. I focused in on conservative evangelical. So this is not a case of, well, the liberals think there's figurative language and the conservatives don't. That is not correct. Most conservative scholars that I've read think that there's significant symbolism and figurative language in Genesis 1 through 11. Or at least that those interpretations are legitimate. They may not completely agree with them, but they think they're a legitimate way to talk about it. And we'll dig into that a little bit more later. So in the book, Dan Kimball mentions two Old Testament scholars, Johnny Miller and John Soden, and they wrote a book called In the Beginning We Misunderstood, interpreting Genesis 1 in its original context. And I thought there were some fantastic quotes from these two. I've actually read this book. It's very good. It's well written, really interesting book. But I thought there were some great quotes in How Not to Read the Bible from their book that I wanted to go over quickly. So here are the two authors. So they said, I realized that all my life I had been reading Genesis from the perspective of a modern person. I had read it through the lens of a historically sophisticated, scientifically influenced individual. I assumed Genesis was written to answer the questions of origins that people are asking today. But I had never asked the most important vital question of all. What did Moses mean when he wrote this text? After all, my Bible was Moses' Bible first. Was Moses acquainted with Charles Darwin? Was he writing to discredit any modern theory of evolution? Were his readers troubled by calculations of the speed of light and the distance of galaxies from Earth? Were they puzzling over the significance of DNA? Were they debating a young Earth versus an old Earth? Would they have had any inkling about a modern scientific worldview? If you agree that the answer to these questions is obviously no, then the logical question is, what was on their minds? How would they have understood Genesis 1? What did Genesis mean to the original author and the original readers? Right? That is the key question we have to answer. So, the next question is, who was the original audience? Who was Genesis originally written to? So Genesis was written to the Israelites around 1200 to 1400 BC, so that's roughly 3,000 years ago, to correct their misunderstandings of God, origins of humans, origins of the heavens and earth, origins of pain and suffering, how their people came to exist, and the promises that were made to their ancestors. Remember, the Israelites had been immersed in a polytheistic Egyptian culture. All the cultures back then were polytheistic. They were all polytheistic, except for Israel. The Israelites had been immersed in a polytheistic Egyptian culture for centuries that taught radically false ideas about God, origins of humans, origins of the heavens and earth, origins of pain and suffering, etc. Right? So here are the kind of questions that the Israelites probably wanted answered. First, are we going to survive here in the desert? Are we safe here? In fact, you see the Israelites many times, it's almost comical, in the book of Exodus and in Numbers saying, we were better off being back in Egypt because we're going to starve to death out here, and Moses, you're a terrible leader. I can't believe you let us out here. Why are we here? We're all going to die, right? So they for sure wanted to know, are we going to survive? Are we safe out here? Is there really only one God? What about all the Egyptian gods? Are they angry that we left Egypt? What do we have to do to please this one God so we will have crops that won't fail and have food for our families? Remember, back then, the gods were responsible for providing fertile crops, for preventing droughts, from preventing famines. And so the Israelites want to know, this Yahweh guy, what do we have to do? How do we worship him so that we will have food to eat and we won't all die? Should we worship the sun? The Egyptians worship the sun. Or the moon. The Egyptians worship the moon too. Or should we worship like the Canaanites who live in the land that we're about to possess? Is the Egyptian story of how the world was made the true one? They had been hearing the Egyptian creation stories, right, for decades, if not centuries. And they want to know, is this really what happened? Is this the way the world was created? But notice that the Israelites were not interested in scientific questions about fossils or the age of the earth or evolution. They didn't know about any of that stuff, and they didn't care about any of it. These are things we care about today. But, Moses and the Israelites did not care about these kind of topics whatsoever. In fact, imagine if God had tried to teach them physics or biology or germ theory or genetics. They would have no idea what he's talking about. So, ancient Israel, right, was surrounded. They were part of the ancient Near East. So they were surrounded by Mesopotamian and Egyptian cultures. So all of these other nations were around them. And they would have been influenced by those cultures. So let's talk about a minute how they would have been influenced by those cultures. So first of all, the ancient Israelites would have been familiar with the creation stories, which is really what Genesis 1 through 11 is. It's a creation story of the ancient Egyptians, Amorites, Sumerians, and other peoples, stories that predated Moses' writing of Genesis, right? So they would have been hearing all of these stories from these other cultures that existed. In fact, today, we still have records of some of these creation accounts, such as the well-known Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh and Enuma Elish, stories describing the creation of the earth and heavens by other gods. These ancient peoples also had a story about a flood, similar in some ways to what we find in Genesis 1 through 8. Now, that book I just mentioned, in the beginning we misunderstood, why it's really interesting is those authors go through these other creation stories in great detail. They go through these two, but they also go through Egyptian stories, and they compare and contrast those creation stories to the book of Genesis. And there are a lot of contrasts. And so when you see the other creation stories compared to Genesis, you see there's some similarities, but there's a lot of differences too. And for me, after I read that book, just light bulbs started going off, because I'm thinking Moses is correcting all of the false ideas in these other creation stories, which the Israelites were familiar with. And that kind of changed completely the way I read Genesis after I learned that. Okay. So this is the earth, right? When you read the Bible and you see the earth, this is the image that pops in your head. You think of a spherical planet that's revolving around the sun and is in a solar system, which is in a Milky Way galaxy, which has billions of stars, and then there's billions of other galaxies. This is the image that comes in your mind when you see the word earth. Well, this is not how the Israelites thought of the earth, right? First of all, they had no idea it was a globe. This picture, we didn't even get pictures of the earth from outer space till like the 1950s or something, or 60s, something like that. So no one who's ever lived even saw pictures like this until a few decades ago. Now, Ptolemy, who lived in about 500 BC, thought he figured out that the earth was actually round, and then Aristotle built on that, and then there were other people that started doing some calculations based on lunar eclipses and things. So I would say by about the time Jesus was born, there were like a small number of really smart people that knew that the earth was round, but it didn't become accepted by the general population for centuries. People were like, that's ridiculous, the earth is not round. This is conceptually how the Israelites would have thought of the earth. To them, the earth, by the way, the Hebrew word that's translated as earth also means land. So whenever I read earth in the Old Testament, I substitute the word land, because they do not think of the earth the same way I think of the earth. They think of the earth as literally the land. So they would have thought of the earth as land, flat land. They knew there were huge bodies of water they could observe that were around the land. They knew that if they dug into the ground for wells, that they would hit water. So they assumed that water was underneath the land, that it was beside the land, and they knew it rained all the time. So they figured there's got to be some water up there somewhere. That's how we get rain, right? And they knew that they could see the sun and the moon crossing the sky every day, doing the same circuit every single day. And they would see these stars up in the sky, and they would also see planets move across the sky. And So just from observing the world around them, this is kind of what they thought. They thought there was flat land, there was the firmament or expanse, which was the sky, and there was some water above that somehow, and then heaven was above that. Now, I don't want you to take this picture too literally. I'm just trying to give you the concept of, if you're an ancient Israelite, how did you view the world, right? You didn't see it like that. You thought of it about like that. That's how they viewed the world, just by simple observation. And everything, the conclusions they came to are perfectly reasonable, right? That's what they could see. So you see this, what scholars call observational language all throughout Genesis 1 through 11. Here's an example, Genesis 1, 6 through 7. God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate water from water." So God made the expanse and separated the water under the expanse from the water above it. Now, if you go back to this picture, the expanse, or the firmament, you can see is the sky is separating the waters above from the waters below. So this is how they would have read Genesis 1, 6 through 7. Basically they would have read it as God created a sky and He separated the waters above from the waters below. Again, how literally did they take that there's like a giant ocean above the sky? No one knows. They might have taken it very metaphorically, but you can see how their idea that there's water above and water below makes total sense and is, true. So God was using common everyday language to communicate truth about the world. The Bible was written to a non-scientific people in a pre-scientific age. It uses observational language where the writers describe the physical world as it appeared to them from their perspective. Okay, this is a big topic. What about inerrancy? So, what I just told you, for maybe some of you haven't thought this far ahead, but after reading the book, you're like, okay, there's alarm bells going off. He's telling me that the Israelites had this conception of the world which we know is not scientifically accurate. We don't live on a flat piece of land that's floating on a giant thing of water. This is not accurate, right? So what about inerrancy? I thought the Bible was without error. Well, if the text of Genesis contains language that clearly contradicts modern science, then don't we have errors in the Bible? The answer is going to be no. The doctrine of inerrancy states that the Bible does not err in what it teaches or affirms. So to prove an error, you have to say that God or Moses was trying to teach physics, was trying to teach astronomy, was trying to teach fill in the blank to the ancient Israelites. So there's two basic approaches to dealing with this. The first approach is the one I take. Other people take approach 2, which I'll get to in a minute. There's probably a third and a fourth and a fifth approach. These are just the two I could think of off the top of my head. Those who believe that Genesis 1 through 11 contains significant figurative and observational language do not agree that the Bible is teaching or affirming scientific concepts. That would be my position. The Bible is not teaching astronomy, cosmology, geology, biology, chemistry, or physics. The ancient Israelites would have known nothing of any of those topics. So to say that the Bible errs because it teaches incorrect facts about these scientific disciplines is nonsense. That's basically what Dan Kimball's saying in the book. Now, another approach you could take, which I used to take this approach 20 years ago, but I've changed. The person who interprets Genesis 1 through 11 in a strict literal sense would agree that the text does indeed contradict modern science, but that just means modern science is wrong. Therefore, the Bible does not err. And what happened with me on my personal journey is when it was just the Bible versus evolution, I started studying macroevolution, and leaving the Bible aside, I felt like macroevolution had significant scientific problems with it that bothered me. But then I started realizing that astronomy and cosmology and geology and all these other fields were contradicting Genesis 1 through 11, and that kind of messed me up because those fields have far more scientific rigor and discipline in them than evolutionary biology does. And so I came to a crossroads where I decided, after going through seminary classes and being taught that there's lots of different ways to interpret Genesis 1 through 11, that I should start looking into these other ways of interpreting it. Because I used to think that there was only one way you could interpret it. Okay. Has the church mistakenly interpreted figurative passages as literal passages in the past? Like, has this ever happened before? Well, yes, it has. Many times. And here's the most famous example. Most people in the church believed that the earth was fixed in place and that the sun and stars moved around the fixed earth. And again, you can see why. It looks like that, right? You go outside. It looks like we are fixed in place and the stars and the sun and the moon are moving around us. And so many Bible verses were interpreted literally, in a literal sense, to back up that interpretation. Here's just a few examples. I mean, you could come up with a bunch. Ecclesiastes 1:5. The sun rises, the sun sets, and then it hurries back to where it rises. And it rises and sets, and it hurries back. Psalm 93:1. The Lord reigns, He's robed in majesty. The Lord is robed in majesty and armed with strength. Indeed, the world or the earth is established, firm, and secure. 1 Chronicles 16:30. Tremble before Him, all the earth. The world is firmly established. It cannot be moved. So people used to read these verses and observe and say, well, the earth is fixed in place. And you can see why they thought that. So what happened? Well, starting in the year 1632 with Galileo, and actually Copernicus discovered it before Galileo, but he was a chicken and didn't want to say anything. So Galileo ended up being the one that got in trouble. But after Galileo, there were a lot of astronomical discoveries, and scientists would eventually provide evidence that the earth actually revolved around the sun. So the earth is not fixed in place. It's actually moving, hurtling. We're all hurtling through space. And the earth is rotating on an axis, and it's going around the sun, and the Milky Way galaxy is also moving. I mean, everything's moving. The earth is not fixed in place. So people have been interpreting these verses referring to the earth in a literal way when they should have been read figuratively. The genres of the books and passages indicate that figurative language is to be expected. This is a key concept. Genre analysis is what determines how to interpret a text, right? You do not read poetry the same way you read a law. You do not read wisdom literature the same way you read a biography. So if you recall, we talked about biblical genres, it seems like forever ago. It's like 6 weeks ago. There are all sorts of genres in the Bible, right? You have history, letters, parables, sermons, songs, poetry, biography. There's all sorts of different genres. So before you set about interpreting a text in the Bible, you need to know what genre are you reading. So what about Ecclesiastes? So I'm going to go over those 3 verses I just had up there. So Ecclesiastes is a book of wisdom literature. And we know that wisdom literature contains significant figurative language. I mean, think about Proverbs, where wisdom is personified all the time. I mean, no one reads Proverbs and goes, oh, there was some lady named Wisdom that was walking around, right? No, we know it's a personification. It's figurative language. And so Ecclesiastes is a book of wisdom literature. And so we should expect there to be figurative language in Ecclesiastes. The other quote, citation was from Psalms. Well, Psalms is a book of poetry. And actually, most of the poetry is probably music or songs. And we know songs contain significant figurative language. So when you read the book of Psalms, you always have to be thinking, okay, this is poetry. I don't want to press this text for, being too literal. Now, Chronicles is interesting because Chronicles is a historical narrative. I mean, Chronicles is meant to record actual historical events. But when you read the verse I quoted, 1 Chronicles 16:30, it's part of a song that David composed. So if you go read 1 Chronicles 16:30, David writes a song. And that verse that talks about how the world is fixed or whatever, that's in a song. So that should tip you off figurative language, right? I should not press this for being overly literal. It's in a song. Okay, so the next question I would have, if I was thinking about this, is if you're telling me that Genesis 1 through 11 has some figurative language in it, and I maybe shouldn't read it in a completely strict literal sense, doesn't that strip all the meaning out of it? And now I throw my hands up, I don't know what Genesis 1 through 11 is saying. Like you've just, if it's not read in a strict literal sense, I can't understand it, right? I've had that conversation with people before. Well, I think there's lots of things you can get out of Genesis 1 through 11, even allowing for some figurative language. These are just a few things, right? There's a lot more than this. But first of all, only in Genesis do we meet a single God, not multiple gods, who has a covenantal and personal relationship with people. In the other creation stories of the ancient Near East, it's always multiple gods, not one. And they never have a covenant with their people, and they certainly did not have personal relationships. You just do not find that in the Egyptian and Mesopotamian creation stories. Unlike other narratives, the God in the Genesis story doesn't need assistance from other gods to create. He is all-powerful and can do it all with just His word. In the other creation stories, I mean, they're kind of humorous to read. You should read them sometime. The gods help each other out and they collaborate and everything. Well, in Genesis, it's Yahweh speaks and stuff happens. He doesn't need anybody's help. So this is a huge difference from the other creation stories of that time. The God in the Genesis creation story creates human beings with dignity and beauty, and they are created in His image. None of the other creation stories reveal a God or gods who treat humans with such love and care. You do not see in the other creation stories any reference to God creating human beings in His image. That is unique to Genesis. The God in the creation story entrusted human beings with the task of caring for creation, rather than creating them as slaves to serve the whims of that God. So in some of the other creation stories, the gods actually create human beings so they can be their slaves and serve them. And Genesis doesn't say anything like that. Mankind is gendered, man and woman being of equal value, with marriage given to mankind for procreation and mutuality, the wife being a helper to her husband. Work is good, a sacred assignment by God to mankind to steward the earth and its creatures. Man and woman alike have freely chosen to disobey God, suffering alienation from God and spiritual death as their just desert, condemned to a life of hardship and suffering during this mortal existence. And finally, despite human rebellion against God, God's original purpose to bless all mankind remains intact as He graciously finds a way to work His will despite human defiance. So again, this is just a handful of the truths you find reading Genesis 1 through 11, right? There's way more than that. This is just a handful of the truths you can find in it. Okay, so I couldn't escape tonight without talking about this. Unfortunately, I'm not going to answer the question really. How do we interpret the 6 days of creation, right? I keep saying there's a lot of figurative language in Genesis 1 through 11, and I'm purposefully not taking positions on what is literal and what is figurative. You can ask me what I think in Q&A, and I may or may not tell you, because in some cases, I don't know. I can't figure it out. But I wanted to at least expose you to this. There are many different interpretations of the 6 days of Genesis 1, right? Most of us are familiar with the young earth interpretation, which takes it very literally, that there were 6 24-hour days that God created, right? But there's the appearance of age interpretation. There's the gap interpretation. There's the preparing the garden and promised land interpretation. There's the day-age interpretation. There's the God's temple interpretation. There's the evolutionary creation interpretation. And there's a bunch more. You can go down a real rabbit hole reading all of the different interpretations for the 6 days, which, again, when I was in seminary and then studying this topic for the last 10, 15 years, I got to a point where I wouldn't say I gave up, but I realized that there were all these brilliant Old Testament scholars, conservative evangelicals, and none of them could agree. In fact, they would all write books where like 5 different views would be in a book, and they would all argue with each other. And the frustrating thing is all of their positions had strengths and weaknesses. And there was never one I could find that was like, oh, that's the best one. That one knocks down everybody else. So there are just a lot of different ways to interpret the 6 days. And I don't know what the correct way is. I really don't. So sorry to ask the question and not really answer it. I just wanted you to understand there's a lot of plausible, legitimate ways to interpret the 6 days. Okay, what about the age of the earth and evolution? I've kind of danced around that the whole time. So how should we think about that? I really like this chart. Oh, that's kind of hard to see. Sorry about that. I did not make this chart, but I thought it was very helpful. So on the first column, you have God created earth and all life. The earth is billions of years old, and evolution describes how life developed, okay? Then you have 4 major views on those 3 topics. And I think these cover the majority of scholarship or people that I've seen. So the first column is atheistic evolution. So these are people that say God does not exist. And so they would say God did not create earth and all life. They would say the earth is billions of years old and evolution does describe how life developed. That's their position. The young earth creation position says God created earth and all life, but the earth is not billions of years old. It's 6 to 10,000 years old, something like that. And evolution does not describe how life developed. The old earth creation view, which is where I currently fall, I might change my mind next week. I don't know. Luckily, this is not an issue of orthodoxy. Old earth creationists say God definitely created everything. The earth is billions of years old, but evolution does not really accurately describe how life developed. And like I mentioned a few minutes ago, I came to doubt evolution not because of the Bible. It had nothing to do with it. I was studying the science. Like, I've read dozens of books written by evolutionary biologists and by others, and I just became convinced that macroevolution, meaning all life on Earth, is the result of random genetic mutations and natural selecting acting on those mutations, cannot possibly explain the diversity of life we have. It just cannot. So that's old earth creation. And then evolutionary creation, they say, yes, God created everything. Yes, the earth is billions of years old. And yes, evolution basically describes how life was developed. So those last three positions are all held by, devout, traditional Christians. Of course, the atheistic evolution one is not. All right, we're just about done. So is the Bible anti-science, right? That's the question we set out to answer in the beginning. And I would say no. It is not anti-science. Why? Because the biblical authors lived in a pre-scientific world. Their audience would have been hopelessly confused if God tried to reveal quantum mechanics. Well, heck, we don't even understand quantum mechanics. Germ theory and genetics. The Bible can't be anti-science because it was never trying to teach science in the first place. That's what I think. That's what the author of the book thinks. You may disagree. But that's why I would say the Bible is not anti-science. For next week, read chapters 13 through 15, which what that's going to be on is, does Christianity claim other religions are wrong? So that will be a lot of fun. Probably not as fun as this week. Okay. So that's it for my presentation. So now we can move into the Q&A or comments, questions.